Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be gathering here to discuss opportunities and strategies to connect workforce development and industrial district development. And just some updates. So today's webinar will start with a short presentation of the main highlights of our study, connecting local people to the prosperity of place, workforce development meets industrial revitalization. And then we'll move on to a discussion with our panelists, and finally open for a broader Q&A with the broader audience. And I'm thrilled to have here Jocelyn Rainey, Chief Administrative Officer and Executive Vice President of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Lee Wellington, Executive Director of the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, and online with us we have Jesse Huck-Leslie, Managing Director of the National Skills Coalition, and Lisa Stark, Assistant Vice President of Public Affairs at Union Pacific Railroad. Thank you so much, everyone, for being available and willing to be here with us today. And I would like to start today's presentation by giving a bit of background of LISC's approach to economic development and how this research is part of the effort. As part of this equitable and inclusive development framework, LISC adopts what we call a three-pronged approach to economic development. We work with local and regional partners to invest in people's talent by providing financial coaching and skills training to connect them to living with jobs. We retrofit and invest in industrial and commercial districts, and we support and provide capital to local small businesses, all with the overall goal to create jobs in these invested communities and to prepare residents to succeed in these jobs. And one way we do that is by focusing on what we call industries of opportunity, or industries that provide living wage jobs and that have low barriers of entry, such as manufacturing. As many of you here today probably are very aware, manufacturing remains a vital component of the American economy, employing nearly 13 million workers today. And there has been a recent growing interest among many municipal partners to promote the growth of manufacturing as a source of good jobs. But despite a lot of these efforts, local inner city residents don't necessarily have access to them. They have all sorts of barriers, as we are all aware. So this study emerged as an attempt to understand how to make these connections, right? How can we connect these investments in industrial districts with programs designed to train and give access to local inner city residents to these growing jobs? So to better understand that and understand, opportunities and challenges around this work, we conducted a series of interviews with industrial district and economic development practitioners, workforce development professionals, advocacy organizations, and city officials throughout the country. And what we found was that a series of emerging strategies that are beginning to tackle these connections, and a few places where this work is more advanced and that we'd like to highlight. One of the strategies that we found concerns using shared spaces as a venue for connecting manufacturing to local communities. Thanks to technological and broader economic shifts across the country, many buildings that used to house large companies now house a variety of small manufacturers, producing a broad range of goods, right, from robotics to craft chocolate. And this shift from one large to many small firms has implications for each employer's ability to train workers and connect them to the local community. Because of their smaller size, these companies are often, not familiar with local training programs. They don't have an HR department, and they just have a harder time recruiting and retaining qualified workers, especially local residents. So some organizations that are managing these spaces, these industrial spaces, are recognizing the needs of their tenant base and are starting to provide a range of business services to support these businesses, including workforce assistance. And in the report, we highlighted some more details. Please feel free to take a look for more detail. Another emerging strategy involves recognizing the potential to connect these smaller manufacturers with the identity of their place and use a local branding campaign as an opportunity to bring these businesses together. Local branding can also serve as a vehicle to connect these manufacturers to their local communities, with the branding organization serving as a liaison to their local workforce. We found a number of municipalities in the country who are really tapping into that and really using that as an opportunity to connect to their local. Okay. Another strategy we found seeks to address a common misperception of manufacturing among the young population. The practitioners we interviewed expressed that many people still have a very outdated view of manufacturing, and there are typically very few opportunities for young people to get exposed to the field. And some localities are really recognizing that and beginning to engage youth, mostly through internship programs and apprenticeship programs at the high school level, most of them. And finally, another relevant strategy we heard about includes engaging manufacturers to develop training curricula. As manufacturers get smaller, their workforce may require more specialized skills, especially within districts, right? Because these are often increasingly small and very diverse businesses with very different workforce needs, which make it a challenge to aggregate their training needs for a program. So recognizing this, a number of manufacturers associations and supporting groups are convening their member base to try to figure out what's the common denominator of skills that they all need, and to create a training curriculum that both cover their needs and also guarantees that the program graduates can get a job afterwards. So these are some of the emerging strategies, but we also found places and organizations they're doing this work and more comprehensively, and that we really would like to highlight. One of them is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Justin is here and can tell you more detail about the work, but we wanted to highlight because we think they're doing a terrific job. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard is a shipyard and large industrial complex, for those not familiar, located in northern Brooklyn, New York City, and was established in the early 1800s to serve as a premier shipbuilding facility in the country. It was decommissioned in the middle of the 20th century, as many industrial districts throughout the country were, and sold to the city of New York. And in the 80s, the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation was established by the city of New York to manage its operations. And now, as a mission-driven organization, the Navy Yard can provide affordable space to manufacturing businesses. And it intentionally partners with local community organizations, local tenant associations to connect residents of the surrounding neighborhoods, historically low-income communities of color, with job opportunities in the yard. Another very interesting example we found for case study is JAMA, or the Jackson Area Manufacturers Association. JAMA was created in 1937 by a dozen manufacturers in Jackson, Michigan, and today has over 260 members from Jackson and surrounding region. And the way they entered workforce training was pretty much out of need. In the early 2000s, after their local community college dropped its trade skills training program, JAMA members, they stepped in to launch the Academy of Manufacturing Careers. So they started partnering with local institutions to start creating a program that really tapped into the needs of their local manufacturing base. And today they offer U.S. Department of Labor certified apprenticeship in 14 occupational tracks, as well as a range of shorter-term certificate trainings in various areas. And another really important component of their work, which I personally find it fascinating, is their youth career exploration and skills building. Because after a couple of years that AMC was running, their member base were disappointed that they were not having enough high school students interested in their programs. So they got together and started partnering with school districts and local organizations to create summer camps and after-school programs focusing on manufacturing for kids that go as early as kindergarten, and build that into a system, a series of training options and opportunities that feeds into their high school apprenticeship program. And finally, the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation is a 40-year nonprofit that assists businesses located in South Brooklyn through a series of business services, as well as connecting local residents to employment and career services. Now, like JAMA and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, SBIDC uses its established relationship with employers that was pretty much built over the years through its business service program to promote quality jobs for local residents. What's key here is that SBIDC is intentionally able to inform employers not only of potential cost savings and business growth, and at the same time educating them about the long-term benefits of adopting labor standards and promoting employee benefits. Now, when we've taken an overall look at these examples of case studies and emerging strategies, we start seeing a number of practice and policy implications. In terms of employee engagement, all successful integration strategies They have built a relationship with employers through business support services first or in parallel with their workforce provision, which really distinguishes their employment engagement approach and helps to explain some of their success. Interviewers highlighted that most of the successful strategies we saw out there were really capitalizing on those relationships that have been built around economic development. Some practitioners highlighted that once you've held a company with like a tax subsidy or even a parking ticket, you've got a friend for life. Next time you call, they will get back to you. And that really captures the spirit of the approach and the relationship. And another related implication the finding suggests is that developing employee engagement through the provision of support services has allowed these organizations to build trust and credibility with employers and businesses, and also gives them an opportunity to advocate and promote worker advancement. For example, practitioners also highlighted that there are many times employers say they don't need people with hard skills, they can train them, they just need people to show up. But once we start unpacking what they're saying and once we start unpacking the context of what they're saying, there are often job quality issues for people that don't show up, or perhaps the work is too hard, or perhaps they're not, no career options down the line. But because they have established the credibility and trust, they can have candid conversations and hopefully address these issues collectively. Our findings also have implications for funders. In the report, we highlight the potential for funders to adopt criteria that potentially gives weight to organizations that combine economic development and workforce training that could be provided either in-house or through established partnerships. And really foster those kinds of collaborations, foster the development of the ecosystem that can support industrial businesses and industrial districts. We also found the importance of integrated service delivery at the workforce level. Because low-income individuals face many challenges sustaining training programs and retaining their jobs, we found it's really important to consider and address barriers to retention. We also found that individuals have the best outcomes when skills training are bundled with other services like financial coaching, income support, and a number of other support services. We also lift the opportunity for regional alliances, especially in groups working with smaller districts, in districts that have businesses that perhaps are too small to have enough jobs, or perhaps the companies are, don't have a lot of opportunities for advancement. They might be able to get better options for their graduates if they partner with regional players or with other districts throughout their regions. In terms of youth pipeline, the findings really reveal that a continuum of exposure and a clear pathway for children allows them to begin to consider manufacturing as a viable career option by the time they get to high school, right? Which really highlights the importance of partnerships with school districts, not just at the high school level, but also at the middle and even elementary school levels, which is something that is not discussed extensively out there, but we thought that it's important to highlight. And finally, on the policy side, the findings highlight the central use that land use and zoning have in really shaping the viability and sustainability of industrial districts, right? Interviews emphasize that a targeted approach to zoning at the local level may help to protect industrial land uses in hot property markets, and at the same time allow their integration in a wider variety of neighborhoods in cities with further growth potential that could benefit from that boost. And at the federal level, interviewees emphasize the transformative role that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act could play if robustly funded and fully implemented. Everyone agreed that WIOAs encourage partnership with strong employee engagement, authorizes the use of funds for services to support job seekers with barriers, but the legislation does not provide secure funding for these activities to be implemented. So secure funding would go a long way to support and expand these strategies. With that, we're going to move to a discussion with panelists and open for a broader Q&A in a few minutes. Just also, if you have questions, please use the chat function, and Sarah is recording them so we can address them at the end. Now, I would like to ask panelists, so when we look at the case studies highlighted, right, they really show a lot of advanced strategies that could already connecting workforce and industrial districts. Like the case studies of Brooklyn AVR, Gemma, Southwest Brooklyn, they've been doing this work for years, right? So we would like to ask you to share, your reflections on what you've seen through your work, on what it takes to build and maintain, especially these relationships, and perhaps share some potential recommendations with practitioners who are beginning to take on this work. And I'll open up to.
I'm happy to start off. So this is Lee from the Urban Manufacturing Alliance. One thing I just note as I think about these case studies is how there are different layers of partnerships that are built into the successful programming. So what was highlighted in this presentation were strong relationships to industry, which are really critical to developing the right types of training curricula and understanding the workforce needs of the businesses. There's also an important need to develop a strong pipeline of local residents to connect to the manufacturing district. They might be living within the manufacturing district, they might be living in neighborhoods adjacent to it, but how do you cultivate those relationships? And some of that gets more complicated when you deal with these perception gaps that you pointed out, that youth may not think of manufacturing as an attractive career pathway, and in fact, maybe their parents fell victim to the manufacturing declines of a generation ago, and they don't see manufacturing as a viable career pathway. And so to your question about partnerships, I think one thing that many of these organizations have done is cultivated partnerships with CDCs that have focused on housing. They've cultivated relationships with folks that might be providing workforce services or business training services that have nothing to do with the manufacturing sector, social services organizations. And Southwest Brooklyn Industrial, for example, in my work, I came across an effort that they had done to collaborate with the Fifth Avenue Committee, which is largely known for its housing and social services. But there they are going about doing bridge building in a way that's more comprehensive than just the industry relationship. Another example I'll just throw out is out of Chicago, and I think it's fascinating just because it brings in a different type of organization than you traditionally see in economic development, which is faith-based organizations. So in Chicago, there's a group called Manufacturing Renaissance, and under that umbrella, they have a Ministers for Manufacturing program. And those ministers from across the city are actually coming together to help engage youth in manufacturing, to provide that level of counseling that might be needed when somebody's going through an apprenticeship program or landed their first job on a factory floor. So those are just a couple of examples of ways to engage partners outside of the industry partner to really make the connectivity soar.
This is Jocelyn from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I agree totally with the support that the job seeker needs and the relationship building that has to happen in the community in order to be able to fill that pipeline. We do a really good job of connecting to our local housing developments and really getting in there and understanding what their needs are and what they feel like some of the barriers are to them doing jobs, especially on the Navy Yard. I think that what I found was really important. I started the Navy Yard 8 years ago, and we more than tripled our placements since I started. And one of the first things that I identified coming from the public sector and being on the other side is that we were focused more on the job seeker and not focused as much on the business, right? And just trying to do that match through what we saw as the job seeker skill and just matching them to a business without really understanding deeply what the business needed, what the work environment was like. So we kind of flipped that model to, we're going to focus on the business so that we can make more placements, and they're going to be successful placements so that we can continue to kind of feed that pipeline of those businesses that are on the Navy Yard. So our businesses they grew to trust us because we were able to make these good connections. And so the way that we do that, and what I think is something that I think is a learning moment for other like organizations, is that you have to spend time in the businesses. You have to understand what they're looking for. You have to understand what motivates them. So I think that, in the study you talked about the things that could happen once a job seeker is on the job that could hinder them. Like, they can't get up on time, right? And or they have other outside influence that keep them from being successful. However, you have to first make sure that you're making that match to what the business needs in order for them to be successful. And the way that we can do that, because we're not we're not the hiring manager, right? We're there to help people connect, is to really help the job seeker to understand what this business is actually looking for. So what we see is that we have really high retention rates, and that our businesses want to use our employment center because we're finding them the candidates in the community that fit their culture, right? And of course, it's not only culture, but that's always the first thing. So the businesses believe that, you know, I have a culture that I want this person to fit, and then I can teach them everything else. It just, that is what it is, right? So we need to deeply understand that. So I think that if, you know, if we as providers look at it from that perspective of, let's have wins with the businesses by understanding them, and then figuring out how to find that job seeker that fits into the job that they're looking for.
This is Lisa.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is going in order, I guess. This is Lisa Stark with Union Pacific Railroad, and, you know, obviously our input based on being a business that supports workforce development and investment in local communities. So there's a few things on this topic and building relationships is, you know, one, I would recommend that people are ready to invest in a program. And that doesn't mean just financially, but that means with your time. Partnerships, you know, they take time to nurture and grow, and they'll continue to evolve as that relationship matures. So going into it with that in mind can, you know, lead to long-term success. Also, clearly defining mutually agreed upon objectives is critical to ensuring that both parties are on the same page when it comes to expected outcomes. And that will really help shape what success looks like. And one thing to keep in mind is, you know, be realistic about your commitment and prepare to be in that for the long run. The partners that you're looking to engage with, they don't really have the time to invest if there aren't strong commitments on both sides. And then, you know, one thing I found to be really successful is, you know, tell your story. Reach out to local officials and community leaders to tell your story. Let them know how you're working to improve community outcomes and get their support. It's really, really helpful for organizations to find a champion for your cause, like a community leader or an elected official who really supports the work your organization is doing. This helps to raise your profile and then also helps you make connections with other like-minded organizations with similar goals. And at the end of the day, that means your network is expanded and will eventually allow you to get more done. And then lastly, you know, top-down buy-in for a program and how it can make the workforce and community stronger is very important. And of course, I have to give a plug, but Union Pacific is extremely fortunate that we have a CEO who believes in the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion and the power that comes with it, and we're able to engage in unique partnerships that support workforce development.
So this is Jessie Leslie. I am with National Skills Coalition, which is a very diverse coalition that works on skills policy at both the state and the federal level. But we also have a companion coalition called Business Leaders United, which is sort of the lens that I'm bringing to this. Because I will say, as a coalition, we've worked on skills policies for a long time, and we actually sort of had this challenge where, even though we felt like we were a coalition that had the voice of business along with all of the other diverse partners, we didn't have, I will say, a meaningful voice of business. We had a few sort of dedicated business leaders. And when we took a step back and started this other coalition called Business Leaders United, to really sort of, for shorthand, be the business arm of our coalition in coordination with another national organization called National Fund for Workforce Solutions, it was a real learning experience, and it made us sort of take some steps backwards in terms of analyzing ourselves about why we had a hard time engaging business. And I think some of the takeaways that sort of cross boundaries from thinking about this from a policy perspective, which is what we do, to a programmatic perspective, which, you know, some of the focus of this report is on and these case studies sort of elevate, is that the biggest thing that we had to do, I think, is sort of take a step back and not just bring in businesses to help us advance solutions that we thought we already had in hand, but to actually work with those businesses to vet whether or not the solutions we are working to advance were the right ones. So I think that's a really key piece, is not going to business with solutions, but going to business to have them help you to create those solutions, to make sure that you really sort of, from a programmatic perspective, are really elevating what's working for them and is getting to the challenges, and doing the same on the worker side as well. I think the other thing that's really important to note, our coalition, Business Leaders United, is mostly small and mid-sized companies. And if you're looking at manufacturing, about 2/3 of the manufacturing companies in the U.S. are shops that have 9 staff or less. So manufacturing is majority small companies. And those are companies that have very little bandwidth to engage in meetings and conversations. And I think this has sort of been said by a couple folks throughout, but I mean, that really gets to the piece that, if there's going to be asks, such as joint outreach or, or shared branding or input on curricula, they need to be clear, concise, directly tied to the value add for the business or industry. But I think it also gets back to the piece that's in the LISC report specifically, which is that any sort of engagement needs to lead with supports for the business. These are businesses that are lean and mean, and they need that support, and they'll see you as a value add, and that will help to ensure the buy-in that you need to, again, work together to come up with the solutions.
One thing I would add is many of these manufacturers have interactions with economic development practitioners that hinge on job creation. How many jobs are you creating? You want to tap into this incentive program? How many jobs are you creating? And, going back to the point of these being very small-scale operations, job creation might not be the name of the game for these businesses. And so industrial district providers and folks that are in a position to actually think more holistically about the sector might start to ask questions like, what are the gaps that are constraining the growth of your business, and how can we start to think about pooling resources for a particular subsector to address those gaps in more flexible ways to meet the needs of these very small-scale firms. It doesn't mean that the job creation potential isn't there. It just might look a little bit differently than it has in the past. And so I can think of programs now that are out there that are designed with a workforce pathway to end up in a pooled contract manufacturing facility that many small-scale firms can draw from. And so when you're interfacing with businesses, don't make the assumption that they're actually looking to create a new job. That might not be their measure of success.
Yeah, this is very helpful and very insightful. It's really shifting the angle that we look at this work, and it's almost like having a community-based perspective on business engagement. So it's kind of like tweaking it around, right? Like a bottom-up approach of engaging businesses. And, we work with a lot of community-based organizations, and we wanted to get your thoughts about, what do you see as key opportunities and challenges for community-based organizations to participate in this work? What multiple roles they could play that you see out there? And as importantly, how can funders better support their work and better encourage these types of connections, this type of work?
So this is Jocelyn. So I love that question. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that, manufacturing businesses are small. The majority of our businesses on the Navy Yard, they're all considered small businesses, but the majority of them are 10 people, 10,000 square feet. And to Lee's point, they're not always thinking about job creation. Sometimes through the work that we do, they find that they're more productive if we're able to give them an intern. And they also don't always have the financial bandwidth to pay for these things or to contribute, and they're not thinking in that way. What I found through the years that I've been doing this work is that training organizations are kind of bound to having large-scale trainings so that they can end up with a job at the end. It's hard to have a job at the end if a small business doesn't know if they're going to actually need that job. So I think that funders need to think more creatively around how are we going to connect people who are disconnected, who are marginalized to work. And some of that might be, unfortunately, for lack of a better word, is training for training's sake.
right? Like having people who are actually getting the training and the skills of the businesses that are here in the city. New York City is never going to have huge opportunities for businesses to bring in job seekers. What they have is a lot of small businesses that have needs throughout the year, and then there seems to be, there's 13 million people who are in manufacturing jobs, but there's still this issue with businesses that feel like there is no talent, right? They can't find the talent. So how do we create these pipelines? And we can talk about that a little bit more when we're talking about youth. But what do we do for adult learners in order to prepare them so that when the job is available, there's someone who's trained available to be placed in that role. So I think that funders could think a little bit differently around funding, because then training organizations can think a little bit differently around how they do training. Yeah, I'm also just thinking about legacy manufacturers that are facing significant challenges with respect to succession planning, and a good amount of their workforce actually nearing retirement, and opportunities there to really target those firms. Those legacy firms tend to be the most disconnected from the base of economic development practitioners that we tend to interface with, and so bridge building there to the best that one can be a really critical way to unlock these job opportunities. And I think it goes back to, again, the business services piece, that if you can lead with the types of business services that a Brooklyn Navy Yard or an SBIDC provide, it can make a real difference. The other thing I would say is not all organizations are going to sort of be armed with these large industrial facilities that become the anchor for all of their services. But we are seeing at UMA a trend across the country of much smaller community-based organizations stepping into the role of industrial developer. And so they are now able to develop the manufacturing space in a mission-oriented way and actually tenant the space with workforce providers on site. So really carefully curate spaces that were smaller, single-use manufacturing buildings in their neighborhoods. And so that's another way that CDCs can really support this effort. And on a district level, they may not want to step into the role of developer, but they can connect the dots between private developers that may not have all of this information at their fingertips around who the workforce organizations are, who the community-based organizations are. They can step into this role of the connective tissue between the developers.
Very helpful.
This is Lisa. I'll let you go, Jessie.
Okay, sorry. We keep going through that. I was just going to say, so this is Jessie with National Skills Coalition. And I have to say, sort of as in my role, I actually am an organizer. And so I think about this from an organizing perspective. And I actually see for community-based organizations playing this connecting role can actually open up doors to some really sort of unique and different alliances that they may not have through other inroads. I mean, particularly organizations that are traditional, anti-poverty organizations. I mean, this does open the door to economic development organizations, to trade associations, to labor unions. I mean, there's a wide range of partnerships here that they're kind of the sky's the limit in terms of where else you take those relationships and where else you take those discussions, but this really is an entryway into a whole new set of partners and conversations. And again, from my perspective, we work on policy, and so it's a lot of different partners that you can work together with to advance even broader solutions on a macro scale.
And this is Lisa Stark with Union Pacific Railroad again. And I would suggest, in alignment of some of the discussion that's occurring today is, that community-based partners absolutely collaborate with local businesses. What that really does, it helps ensure that the skill sets needed now and in the future are reflected in today's training programs. I would say that it's also important to understand varying employers' job requirements. For example, if they're willing, to be a second chance employer, or what type of, if there are folks with records in the community that are looking for employment, whether or not there are businesses that exist that would be able to hire those kind of job seekers. And, internships, this is kind of something that was a theme that I took away from the white paper, but internships are a great way to expose individuals to career paths that they may not have been exposed to previously. And that's something we really see in the railroad industry when we're looking for qualified applicants for a lot of our positions is, a lot of people aren't aware that jobs in the rail industry exist unless they had a father, an uncle, or a grandfather who worked for a railroad. And then when we think of workforce development, a lot of times we're thinking in relation to children or disadvantaged, but I think it's also critical that we focus on how, as someone else has stated, how are we really upskilling the current workforce and making sure that their skills grow and advance as technology evolves. And community partners, may also want to be thinking about targeting a specific population with the greatest need in their areas. This could, be a focus on women, other minorities, high school students, former justice-involved youth, vocational training participants, or community college students, for another example. And, one thing that I think we found valuable at Union Pacific in working with our workforce development partners is instilling in them that it's important to understand what a specific industry's workforce needs are. And to do that, it's really beneficial if practitioners can take the time to get to know an industry and really understand their workforce needs. And for example, in the railroad industry, one thing that we like to do in spending time with, our community partners is bringing them into one of our rail yards, showing them a tour of the rail yard, taking them into a locomotive repair shop, and allowing them to really see what are those types of jobs that exist in those facilities, and how does a rail yard just in itself function? How does that work? And by just having that exposure and understanding, that allows us to share what kind of jobs need to be filled, and then working with our community-based partner, helping to create curriculum that really kind of focuses on the skill sets that are needed to fill those jobs. And then lastly, I would just suggest certainly, community-based partners should identify companies who have existing funding programs that support the work either they're doing today or that they seek to develop. For example, one of Union Pacific's key philanthropic funding programs focuses very specifically on workforce development. So for us, it was a very natural alignment to workforce training opportunities and working with LISC on the Financial Opportunity Center model as well.
Yeah, that's terrific. And the role of community-based organizations is clearly multifaceted and can be the connector, can be the leader. It depends a lot on the context and the capacity of the group, right? But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the role of policy, right? Because it really shapes a lot of this work and determines its success to a great extent. So I would like to ask panelists to reflect a little bit on how do they see the role of policy either at the federal level or the local level shaping this work? What do you see as challenges or promising developments perhaps that you see are really being a positive advancement?
Well, I think much of the policy that affects the day-to-day work of a manufacturer happens at the local level or even the very hyper-local level. You mentioned land use and zoning being a really significant theme in your paper. I think that's true across the country, whether you're in a hot market or a weak market, that the underlying zoning can really hinder or help the growth of the manufacturing sector. So I think that's just one thing to flag. The other thing is partnerships at various levels of government, federal and state, around certifying different apprenticeships. So, for example, I'm thinking about in garment and textile. We now, as a result of work of a sewing institute out of Detroit called Isaac, have one of the first provisionally approved programs out of the Federal Department of Labor for industrial sewing. So now we're professionalizing this career. We're creating a career pathway around it. And so that's a place where partnership with the public sector can make a really critical impact. And I'll also just throw out there that some of the work, I wouldn't bucket this as policy, but more relationship to the public sector can be around simply acknowledging and celebrating the manufacturing sector. It could be something as simple as a local elected official touring a manufacturing facility, or something as grand as the Manufacturing Day efforts that play out across the country. Manufacturing Day is coming up. It actually really spans across the full month of October, and that's a real opportunity to help open up the doors of manufacturing businesses to the public. It's also a way for community-based organizations to understand the needs of manufacturers, using a tour as a really benign way to get in the door. One thing I'll just throw out there about those tours is when you're thinking about who is giving the tour from the manufacturing business, really making sure that you have a representative group of folks that are introducing the manufacturing business to community. It might mean a mix of owner and workforce to help make sure that when people walk into these spaces, they feel like they can see themselves within them.
Hi, this is Jessie with National Skills Coalition. And I have to say, again, being a policy organization, I see there being a lot of opportunity here. And this is actually, the entire reason our business engagement work, Business Leaders United, exists. So businesses, and we're working on the ground collaboratively with partners, investing in their workforce, and still not seeing the results they wanted. And so they came to sort of this common table to advance system change. I think that, if we're talking about sort of looking at the report and sort of seeing some of these things at work, we're talking about partnerships, we're talking about integrated supportive services. There are some real opportunities, I think, at both the federal and state level to work to integrate those principles into a lot of our state's skills policies. I think, most immediately, when we're looking at the federal level, we actually have a number of sort of policies that are actually sort of in movement right now. I think a lot credited back towards partnerships like those that you've elevated. In fact, JAMA, Bill Rail, JAMA has worked closely with us for many years to help to shape these policies. I mean, we have the Community College to Career Fund Act, which is all about business and community college partnerships, in the Higher Education Act. The Partners Act, which is investing in partnerships like these in the report to expand work-based learning. The Builds Act, which supports partnerships and expands supportive services and diversify and grow the pipeline within infrastructure industries. I mean, each of these policies have been developed and advanced by business and practitioner partners together, and because of that have been able to sort of gain bipartisan support. So I think there's some real opportunity here to elevate sort of these practices, these models that are actually working on the ground, and to create policies that support these models. There's also a lot of work being done on the state level that sort of mirrors this federal work. Some of it, mirrors the federal work. Some of the federal work mirrors the state work. But we actually have 7 state blue Business Leaders United coalitions right now working on state policy, and are adding 8 more next year. So I'd say that we see there being a huge amount of opportunity to shape policies now because of the huge demand for workers.
So this is Jocelyn from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I think that the focus on apprenticeships and internships, I'm really excited about that, studying it and trying to really understand it and think about that, because, again, we're talking about small businesses. So any opportunity that we can get to get, folks on the factory floor to really understand the business is really important, and those things lead to jobs, right? So I think that I'm really excited about that and those conversations that are happening around that. And I think that just really thinking a lot about on-the-job training dollars. They were really successful in getting businesses engaged with hiring people and getting them started, because, there was a subsidy that was connected to that, and that's really important, along with individual training grants. I think that there's more individual training grants, and there's more opportunities for the city and state to look at, broadening the sectors that they're actually doing the trainings in, and thinking a little bit more about how do you create more training around manufacturing roles. And then I'm really, and again, the DOE with the Brooklyn Steam Center, the Brooklyn Steam Center at the Brooklyn Navy Yard,
being able to have a program that is just focused on that career and technical training that young people have, exposing them to the manufacturing design jobs and getting them excited about those roles and not thinking about that as dirty work, right? And not thinking about, CTE schools as schools where you go when you can't succeed in regular schools, and then connecting that to a business. I'm particularly excited about that because when you think about the wage gap between people of color and, people who aren't of color, then you think those are the ways that you do, that's the way that you close those wage gaps is by doing that kind of work. So all of these are really things that the city and state have been moving forward with, but those are the areas where I think that we could just see a lot better outcomes in the labor market if we did a little bit more focus on training and apprenticeships and internships.
And this is Lisa at Union Pacific. As we think about government funding support for workforce development, policymakers, in my opinion, should continue to allocate funding where it will have the greatest impact. And expanding authorized use of public workforce funding to a more localized level, I think would be really helpful. Particularly at the local level, public funding investment provides an opportunity to leverage more private dollars that otherwise may not exist. So when we're looking at opportunities for public and private investment in something, the fact that public dollars are put into a project, you have that ability for a private business to say, wow, this is something really good that we can get behind and we can focus in some investment here. And if the public funding didn't exist for that, the likelihood of the private side coming on and making those investments, it tends to go away a little bit, or it's harder to ascertain. But when you look at businesses, they want to invest in communities where their employees live, work, and recreate, and that's a big deal. So I think that, policies that can help take advantage of that or incentivize that would be really beneficial. And then one thing maybe also to think about is incentive funding for programs that are replicated from an existing highly successful program somewhere else. We've got some amazing panelists with us today that have some programs that have just been outlandishly successful that, if another agency wanted to replicate something, it maybe not be 100% duplicatable. It would have to be focused on what local needs are. But boy, if you could incentivize some funding for someone that doesn't have to create a brand new program from the ground up, but can use another program as a model, that may be very helpful in terms of having an impact much more in the near term than in the longer term. And one thing that I found helpful just in my career and being part of associations and working in the legislative arena is to support sound policy decisions. Community partners should join like-minded organizations or associations to convey their messages and their priorities to policymakers. There's inherent strength when organizations speak with a unified voice. And then lastly, as others have indicated and as was described in the white paper, rezoning or repurposing existing sites for mixed use that's compatible with local neighborhoods while at the same time supporting job growth it's a good idea, right? And this isn't a new concept. When you think about the myriad of community facilities that are repurposed for joint uses locally, an example of that would be a school that is co-located next to a city-owned public library, or a school that also has county health services associated with it. So again, joint use of facilities and buildings equates to resource savings, and it stretches community dollars. And I think for anybody, efficiency and cost savings is always good public policy.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. This is all very, very helpful and insightful. And we would like to open up for questions from the audience. Sarah, could you get a few questions for us?
So first, can you expand on some of the zoning strategies to protect, support, and encourage manufacturing in an urban environment?
Yeah, this is Lee from the Urban Manufacturing Alliance. I can comment on this. So one of the things that we've looked at across the country are artisan zoning ordinances. So we've seen these in areas where manufacturing is actually being used as an attraction tool. And I'll get into some of the other dynamics where this may not make sense. But the goal here is to actually weave manufacturing into commercial corridors or into mixed-use neighborhoods. And you often have to make small tweaks to the zoning code in order to do that. Imagine a commercial corridor where no physical production is allowed, right? There may be a way that you can adjust that slightly so you can allow for production without overtaking the retail corridor entirely, requiring a certain percentage of the space to actually be used for retail and a certain percentage of the space to actually be used for production that fuels that retail. So you can get pretty specific in the way that you create these artisan zoning ordinances. Some of them, the underlying zoning codes may not need modernization at all, but there is sort of this galvanizing effect, much like a local brand, of lifting up something and unifying it as an artisan zone or as a manufacturing zone. So it's as much about place identification and neighborhood identification as it is about making these adjustments to the zoning code to make some of this production of physical products permissible. Then on the flip side, so that's sort of like the industrial attraction strategy. On the flip side is sort of the industrial protection realm, which sitting here in New York City, that's what I spent a good chunk of my career on, where there are efforts to actually stabilize industrial zones from uses that may not actually be incompatible, but may drive up the land such that the manufacturing user can't actually access it anymore. So in New York, for example, we have the Industrial Business Zones program, which is a commitment at the local mayoral level to not rezone certain areas for non-industrial use. There are additional layers to that zone that say that certain uses that tend to occupy industrial zones can no longer occupy them. So there are these questions around self-storage and hotels that may actually make the industrial zones more vulnerable to real estate speculations from uses that may command a higher rental revenue. So those are just a snapshot of programs, but there's certainly a whole array of programs I could get into on a separate webinar.
More questions, Sarah?
Earlier on, there was a reference to the misperceptions of the manufacturing sector. Can you tell us a little bit more about the assets and opportunities that are not well known?
Anybody wants to tackle that?
I think we're talking about it.
Yeah.
The fact when we were talking about the difference that manufacturing has changed and about the smaller and the kind of high design.
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in here as well. I think, certainly I think one of the first misconceptions about the manufacturing sector is that there actually isn't job opportunity at all. And so that it isn't a sector where you actually can find employment. People don't necessarily understand the nature of the sector and how the size of these firms are quite small, and that the facilities don't actually feel like what you'd imagine a factory floor to feel like. I think people have old notions of factories as being dirty and polluting facilities, and meanwhile, the manufacturing sector, particularly in urban environments, are sort of on the front lines of sustainability and creating spaces that you actually want to be in. There is a tremendous synergy between design and manufacturing, between technology and manufacturing, between arts and manufacturing, so much so that many of these manufacturers don't even call themselves manufacturers. So the sector faces a real definitional problem, which I think in turn creates a whole host of challenges when district directors are trying to connect people to the manufacturing sector and better understand the needs of the manufacturing sector, and it's not always defined all that clearly. So that in a nutshell, I think, sort of maps out some of these perception gaps.
Yeah, I can also add to that. So when we were interviewing the Southwest Brooklyn IDC, they were mentioning that, it was challenging to recruit young people to to some of the manufacturing jobs that they're trying to place. And, what they share with us is that they realize a lot of the times there's really changing the visuals of even the marketing materials, even that really change people's perception. So a lot of it is an issue of perception. Young people don't know the variety of jobs that, of what manufacturing and industrial world entail. So really exposing and broadening their horizons and what a manufacturing occupation could look like and the different options within it, I think will go a long, long way, which really supports what Lise was just saying.
Someone also wrote in to say, we have a large and small private NDOD manufacturing corporations locally. Where do we begin, both from a relationship and partnership perspective as well as from a seed capital perspective?
So this is Lee again. I think one place to start is actually to look at the organizations that may already be serving this network of manufacturing corporations and understand how you can work collaboratively with them. So who is your local manufacturing extension partnership organization? What are they doing to serve the sector? What kinds of programs what are the kinds of programs that you can join in on? There are often these sort of more informal networks that exist too of manufacturers through your local maker spaces, through an industrial bid that you may not be working with already. And so I think using those sort of places where folks have aggregated as a starting point, chambers as well can be an interesting starting point. But again, acknowledging that you're only going to get a subset of the manufacturing business community. UMA has worked on a report that recently released, the State of Urban Manufacturing, that talks a lot about the challenges of tapping into your smaller maker businesses. I think that's where it becomes most problematic, are these businesses that are at just the position to scale, but often slip through the cracks in connecting to any of the organizations that I just listed. And there, I think one of the best avenues is actually university partnerships. Because they're going to be tuned into some of the makers and manufacturers that are coming out of their community colleges and their university systems, and might be able to make some links to businesses that way. So those are some interesting starting points, but I don't think there's any one way to start. I think the final point I'd add is just to emphasize the importance of these local branding initiatives across the country. I'll just make a quick plug that UMA has a toolkit for communities to think about how to create a local brand and what can go into that effort. It's so much more than just building a sense of place identification. It can be a home for convening and wraparound services. So that's another good place to start in terms of programmatic strategy.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. We have two, but okay. So most manufacturing jobs these days are very high tech. How do you marry the traditional manufacturing job training with the necessary technical knowledge and training?
So this is Jessie with National Skills Coalition. I would say the biggest piece right here is that there's a lot of innovation happening in this space. So number one, not trying to recreate the wheel. And I know we're talking about manufacturing specifically on this call, but I also feel like there is a lot that sort of parallels the kind of learning that needs to happen within the manufacturing sector within other industries. So also looking outside of the manufacturing industry to see how learning is happening. I will say this is really the space where, if we're talking about community-based organizations being connectors, that there is just a huge amount of opportunity there. I mean, the community colleges, the partnerships between community colleges and manufacturing have been really impressive in a lot of places, and I think that's really sort of manufacturers themselves do not have the capacity to do all the kinds of training that needs to happen for people to be able to work on those shop floors. And so being able to, that's really where I think these community-based organizations can shine in terms of connecting with community colleges, other CBOs, and other partners in the community that can provide those kinds of services and provide them not just to one business, but like we're talking about to an industry within a region.
Yeah, and I think as you're thinking about industry-wide initiatives, I think part of it is going to be relying on the manufacturer, but also looking at who are the prospective tech partners for that manufacturer. There are programs out there that sort of marry legacy manufacturers with technology partners. Those technology partners may be disconnected from the curricula that's being built for the workforce programming. So making sure that there's linkages there, not just for tech that's being used on today's factory floors, but for technology that is going to be applied down the line. And I know Isaac out of Detroit, the selling initiative that I referenced, is actively thinking about this as they roll out their curriculum for apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships, both in Detroit and nationally, is how do we actually make sure that we're not just building a training program that's static, but actually something dynamic and weaves in technology that may not actually be in use at the moment.
Thank you, everyone. So we recorded this webinar, and we're going to be sharing through our LISC Institute website. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And I would like to thank you again, our panelists, Jocelyn, Lee, Jesse, and Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to advance this work. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here.